The first sign that something was wrong did not come from a crime scene, a witness, or a frantic emergency call. It came from absence. A man who followed a dependable routine suddenly stopped appearing where he was expected to be. Matthew Johnson, a member of the Utah National Guard, had responsibilities that required reliability. His schedule had patterns. His communication habits were consistent. People who knew him were accustomed to hearing from him. When that pattern broke, it stood out. At first, the change appeared small. A missed check-in, a message that never arrived. Time passed and the silence continued. Colleagues began to notice the gap. A person can be late, a phone can lose signal. Life sometimes interrupts routine, but this felt different. Hours stretched longer than they should have. Concern slowly replaced patience. Someone reached out again. No reply came. The quiet remained. Eventually, the question shifted from inconvenience to worry. Where was Matthew Johnson? That question began moving through conversations, across phones, and into official attention. A simple absence had turned into something far more troubling, something that demanded answers. Matthew Johnson was not someone who simply disappeared from daily life without explanation. His work demanded responsibility and structure. Those who served alongside him were accustomed to discipline and reliability. When someone in that environment failed to show up, it rarely passed unnoticed. Absences carried meaning because every role mattered. When Matthew did not report as expected, the absence raised questions. At first, the assumption was simple. Perhaps a personal matter required his attention. Perhaps he had taken an unexpected leave. Yet attempts to reach him produced nothing. Calls went unanswered. Messages remained without response. Hours continued to pass without contact. The concern moved beyond routine curiosity. In workplaces built on accountability, silence can signal a serious problem. The people around Matthew understood that. They began asking each other if anyone had heard from him recently. No one had. That realization brought a quiet shift in tone. This was no longer a scheduling issue or a delayed reply. Something had changed in a way that could not be easily explained. Matthew Johnson, a man known for reliability, was suddenly gone. The discovery that followed added a new layer to the growing concern. Matthew Johnson's vehicle was located not far from the area where he lived. Finding the truck should have brought relief. Instead, it deepened the confusion. A missing person who leaves behind a vehicle raises difficult questions immediately. Transportation is usually the first tool someone uses when leaving voluntarily. The truck appeared ordinary at first glance. There were no obvious signs of damage, no shattered windows. No marks suggesting a violent struggle had occurred around it. To anyone passing by, it could have looked like a vehicle simply left in place for a short time. Yet investigators know that context matters more than appearance. A vehicle parked without explanation becomes significant when the person who drives it cannot be located. The truck confirmed one important fact. Matthew Johnson had not simply driven away to begin a new life somewhere else. His primary means of travel remained behind. That single detail turned a missing person concern into a deeper puzzle. Inside the truck, investigators found another detail that made the situation far more difficult to understand. Matthew Johnson's phone was still there. In modern life, a phone is rarely separated from the person who owns it. People carry them everywhere. They are tools for communication, navigation, and connection. Leaving one behind can happen occasionally, but doing so during an unexplained disappearance is unusual. The presence of the phone suggested something important. If Matthew had chosen to leave voluntarily, he would likely have taken the device with him. It held contacts, messages, and access to information that most people depend on every day. Abandoning it would create obstacles rather than convenience. Investigators often look for what people take with them and what they leave behind. Those choices can reveal intention. In this case, the phone remained in the truck, silent and unused. No new messages were sent. No calls were made. The discovery did not answer the question of where Matthew Johnson had gone. Instead, it made the question far more serious. By the time the truck and phone were accounted for, one fact remained unchanged. Matthew Johnson himself could not be located. Search efforts began focusing on the most direct possibilities. Friends were contacted. Places he had visited before were checked. Investigators attempted to determine whether anyone had seen him recently. Each effort returned the same result. There were no confirmed sightings after the point when his routine ended. No witnesses who could say where he had gone. No messages indicating a plan to travel or meet someone elsewhere. The trail simply stopped. Missing person cases often contain small leads that guide investigators forward. A security camera image, a purchase recorded on a bank statement, a call made from an unfamiliar location. In this situation, those leads were absent. The evidence pointed only to silence. Matthew Johnson had vanished without leaving a clear path behind him. For investigators, that absence of direction can be as significant as any physical clue. When someone disappears without explanation, the questions grow heavier with every passing day. As the investigation continued, attention gradually moved toward the person who would normally know the most about Matthew Johnson's life. When someone disappears, investigators often begin with the individuals closest to them. Those relationships hold daily knowledge, schedules, habits, recent conflicts, and private concerns. In Matthew's case, that person was Jennifer Gledhill. As his spouse, she shared the same household and the routines that shaped their family life. She would naturally be among the first people asked about his whereabouts. Questions about when he was last seen, where he planned to go, and whether anything unusual had occurred would be directed toward her. These conversations are standard procedure in missing person cases. Investigators seek information, not conclusions. Still, the circumstances surrounding Matthew Johnson's disappearance were already unusual. A vehicle left behind. A phone was left inside it. No contact with friends or colleagues. When those elements combine, the focus of an investigation often shifts toward the home environment. What happened inside that house became a question investigators could not ignore. As investigators examined the available information, another layer of complexity began to emerge. Missing person cases sometimes resolve quickly when new evidence surfaces. A person may be located in another city, or a misunderstanding may explain the disappearance. In this situation, the opposite occurred. The more investigators looked into Matthew Johnson's absence, the more unusual the circumstances appeared. One troubling possibility entered the discussion: the idea that a crime might have taken place even though the person believed to be harmed had not been found. Prosecutors would later present a theory that Matthew Johnson had been killed during a conflict connected to his marriage. According to that theory, the act occurred inside the home where he lived with Jennifer Gledhill. Yet the case carried a complication rarely seen in homicide investigations. The remains of Matthew Johnson were not recovered. The weapon prosecutors believed had been used was also missing. Two critical pieces of evidence were absent. Despite that, the legal system moved forward with a charge of murder. Cases like this force investigators, prosecutors, and the public to confront a difficult question. In many homicide investigations, the discovery of a body confirms the reality of the crime. It provides medical evidence and establishes the cause of death. Without that confirmation, the situation becomes far more complex. The absence of remains creates uncertainty that must be addressed through other forms of evidence. In the case involving Jennifer Gledhill and Matthew Johnson, that challenge became central. Prosecutors argued that enough evidence existed to prove that Matthew Johnson was dead and that the death was not accidental. They believed the surrounding facts formed a clear picture of what had taken place. Yet the lack of a recovered body remained a defining feature of the case. It left space for questions that could not easily be answered. Where was Matthew Johnson? What had truly happened during the final hours before he vanished? And how could a court determine responsibility when the most direct evidence was missing? Those questions would shape everything that followed. How do you prove a murder when there is no body? That question sits at the center of this case. Investigators must rely on evidence that points toward an event no one directly witnessed. Patterns of behavior, physical traces, digital records, and statements from people involved can all become part of the answer. Each piece adds weight to the larger picture. Consider how unsettling it would feel if someone you knew suddenly disappeared without explanation. One day they are present in daily life, responding to messages and following their routine. The next day there is silence. Calls go unanswered. Familiar patterns vanish. The absence becomes impossible to ignore. That is exactly the situation surrounding Matthew Johnson. A man with responsibilities, a family, and a structured life disappeared in a way that left investigators searching for answers. The story that follows examines how that disappearance turned into one of the most unusual criminal cases in recent memory. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Bedtime Black Files, where life's most powerful lessons are revealed through unforgettable true crime events from around the world. If you're stepping into our community for the first time, I'm truly glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into it, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Consider hitting the subscribe button. Don't forget to like and share this video with someone who needs it. Your support helps our family grow, connect, and keep these powerful stories alive. Before his disappearance became the focus of a criminal investigation, Matthew Johnson lived a life that appeared grounded in routine and responsibility. People who knew him often described him as someone who valued structure. His commitments were not casual obligations. They were duties he took seriously. That attitude shaped the rhythm of his days and the expectations others had of him. Matthew Johnson served as a member of the Utah National Guard, a role that required discipline and reliability. Service in that environment is built on trust. Each person depends on the others to meet responsibilities, follow orders, and maintain readiness. Those who work within that system quickly notice when a colleague behaves differently from what is expected. For Matthew Johnson, consistency was part of how others recognized him. His colleagues were accustomed to seeing him report for duty, participate in training, and communicate when necessary. Reliability becomes a reputation over time. When someone consistently fulfills obligations, that pattern forms a kind of quiet identity. Yet a person's life cannot be understood solely through professional responsibilities. Beyond his service commitments, Matthew Johnson was also a father. His daily life included moments that existed far from military routines. Family activities, school schedules, and ordinary responsibilities shaped the other half of his world. Those who looked at his life from the outside often saw a picture that appeared stable. A father raising children, a member of a military organization maintaining discipline, a household continuing through the routines that families build over time. Nothing about that image suggested that his name would eventually appear in court documents connected to a homicide investigation. At that stage, Matthew Johnson was simply a man living his life, moving through familiar routines and fulfilling the roles that defined him. Service in the National Guard carries a unique balance of responsibilities. Members maintain civilian lives while also preparing to respond when called upon by their state or country. That dual commitment demands adaptability. A person must shift between ordinary routines and the expectations of military structure without hesitation. Matthew Johnson had spent years working within that environment. Training exercises, scheduled duties, and coordination with other service members were part of the professional framework surrounding him. The work required attention to detail and the ability to operate within a team where reliability mattered. For individuals who serve in this role, trust develops through repetition. A person shows up when expected. Instructions are followed carefully. Responsibilities are shared across the group. Over time, these patterns form the foundation of professional relationships. When one member fails to appear without explanation, it quickly attracts notice. That is part of what made Matthew Johnson's disappearance stand out so sharply. His colleagues were familiar with his normal behavior. They understood the rhythm of his participation and the way he communicated when schedules changed. When someone with that reputation stops responding, the absence carries weight. Military service often shapes a person's identity in ways that extend beyond work hours. Discipline becomes part of daily life. Planning and accountability influence how time is managed and how responsibilities are handled. Those habits do not remain confined to the workplace. They follow a person home. For Matthew Johnson, the values associated with service formed an important part of who he was. They influenced how he approached both his professional role and the obligations waiting for him at home. Away from military duties, Matthew Johnson's life centered around his children. Family responsibilities filled the hours that were not dedicated to work or training. The routines of raising children, school mornings, evening meals, and daily conversations became the framework for much of his time at home. Parenthood creates a different type of responsibility than professional service, but it carries its own demands. Children depend on stability. They rely on the adults around them to provide structure, protection, and guidance. Those expectations shape the environment inside a household. Matthew Johnson shared that environment with 3 children, each at an age where parental presence plays an important role in daily life. The rhythms of family schedules influence everything from work commitments to weekend plans. School events, activities, and ordinary moments form the background of a household's routine. For people who knew the family, those routines likely appeared familiar. Many households follow similar patterns. Parents balance professional obligations while managing responsibilities at home. Days move forward through small tasks that rarely attract attention from outsiders. Because these routines feel ordinary, they rarely appear remarkable at the time. Yet they define the structure of family life. The quiet repetition of daily responsibilities creates a sense of continuity. When something disrupts that continuity, the impact spreads beyond the individual who is missing. It affects every part of the household. Before the events that would later draw investigators into the family's life, Matthew Johnson's identity included this role above all others: a father responsible for the well-being of his children. The household Matthew Johnson shared with Jennifer Gledhill was, at first glance, similar to many others. Families develop routines that appear ordinary from the outside. Neighbors see people coming and going. Children leave for school. Vehicles move in and out of driveways. Daily life unfolds in ways that rarely attract attention. Within that environment, the responsibilities of parenting and maintaining a household require constant cooperation. Decisions about schedules, finances, and family activities shape the direction of everyday life. Couples often balance these responsibilities through communication and shared planning. From an outside perspective, the home where Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill lived might have seemed unremarkable. There was no obvious sign to suggest that the household would later become the center of a criminal investigation. Yet appearances rarely reveal the full complexity of a relationship. Every marriage contains private conversations, disagreements, and pressures that outsiders do not see. Financial concerns, emotional stress, and personal conflicts can exist quietly behind closed doors. Those realities do not always signal danger. Many couples experience tension without it leading to severe consequences. Still, when investigators later examined the events surrounding Matthew Johnson's disappearance, they had to consider the dynamics within the household itself. The home environment became important because it was the place where Matthew Johnson was last known to have been present. Understanding what occurred inside that space became a critical step in determining what might have happened to him. Jennifer Gledhill was not initially known to the public beyond her role within the family. She was the person who shared the household with Matthew Johnson and participated in raising their children. Like many individuals whose lives remain private, she existed largely outside public attention before the investigation began. Within the structure of the family, Jennifer Gledhill managed responsibilities that accompany parenting and maintaining a home. Those tasks can involve coordinating schedules, overseeing daily activities, and navigating the practical demands that come with raising children. These responsibilities shape the rhythm of family life and require constant attention. When investigators began examining Matthew Johnson's disappearance, Jennifer Gledhill naturally became one of the first people they spoke with. In cases involving missing individuals, Law enforcement often begins by gathering information from those closest to the person involved. Spouses, relatives, and friends can provide insight into recent events or potential concerns. At that stage, the purpose of those conversations is to understand circumstances rather than assign blame. Investigators seek details about the final time the missing person was seen, any unusual behavior, and any known plans that might explain the absence. Jennifer Gledhill's connection to Matthew Johnson meant that she occupied a central position in those discussions. As his spouse, she shared the same home and daily environment. Her perspective could potentially clarify events leading up to his disappearance. What investigators would eventually discover, however, would cause them to look much more closely at the relationship itself. At the beginning of any investigation, information arrives gradually. Detectives rarely receive a complete picture all at once. Instead, they gather fragments of detail and attempt to place them within a larger timeline. Each interview, record, or observation adds another layer to the developing narrative. When Matthew Johnson was first reported missing, the situation appeared uncertain. There was no immediate confirmation that a crime had occurred. Missing person investigations often begin with hope that the individual will be located safely. Many cases resolve when the person returns or is found elsewhere. Yet as investigators reviewed the circumstances surrounding Matthew Johnson's disappearance, the questions surrounding the household began to grow more significant. The focus on the relationship between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill increased as detectives attempted to understand what had happened during the days before he vanished. Public records later revealed that the couple had been experiencing serious marital conflict during that period. Reports described a contentious divorce process and disputes that had drawn legal attention before Matthew Johnson's disappearance. Details like these do not immediately determine what occurred, but they influence how investigators evaluate the situation. Relationship tension can provide context for events that might otherwise appear random or unexplained. For detectives examining the case, the marriage itself gradually became a central point of interest. Understanding the dynamic between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill was necessary to determine whether the disappearance resulted from voluntary action, misfortune, or something far more serious. The story that would eventually unfold forced investigators to examine that marriage in ways no one had anticipated when the case first began. Marriages rarely collapse overnight. The process often begins quietly, long before outsiders recognize that anything is wrong. Small disagreements accumulate over time. Conversations that once ended in understanding begin to end in frustration. Eventually, the tension grows strong enough that both people realize the relationship is no longer functioning the way it once did. That gradual shift appears to have taken place within the marriage between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill. For years, their lives had followed the pattern typical of many families: work responsibilities, parenting duties, and shared routines within the same household. Yet by the summer of 2024, the relationship had reached a point where continuing together no longer seemed sustainable. Public court records show that Jennifer Gledhill formally filed for divorce in July of that year. Filing for divorce marks a decisive step. It signals that private disagreements have progressed beyond reconciliation attempts and into a legal process designed to dissolve the marriage entirely. Divorce proceedings often require couples to examine every aspect of their shared lives. Property arrangements, parenting responsibilities, and financial matters all become part of the discussion. What once existed as a private partnership now enters a structured legal framework. For Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill, that process introduced a new layer of stress. Divorce rarely unfolds without emotional strain. Even when both parties agree that separation is necessary, the transition can be painful. The process forces people to reconsider plans they once believed would last a lifetime. The filing itself did not immediately change the daily environment of the household. Both individuals still lived within the same broader context of family responsibilities and shared history. Yet once divorce papers are filed, the relationship begins to shift in subtle ways. Every conversation carries the awareness that the future will soon look different, and that awareness can transform ordinary disagreements into something far more intense. Once divorce proceedings begin, couples often find themselves navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. The certainty that the relationship is ending can heighten feelings that may have existed quietly before. Frustration, resentment, disappointment, and anger can all surface as people attempt to redefine their lives separately. For Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill, the period following the divorce filing appears to have been marked by significant tension. Reports from court proceedings describe the marriage as deeply strained during those months. The disagreements that had once occurred privately now became part of a broader legal conflict. When couples remain in close proximity while navigating divorce, daily interactions can become complicated. Simple decisions about schedules, household responsibilities, or parenting arrangements can trigger arguments. Each conversation carries the weight of unresolved grievances. Those tensions can affect the atmosphere inside the home. Words spoken in frustration may linger long after the moment passes. Misunderstandings multiply when trust has already begun to erode. During this time, Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill were also preparing for the legal stages of their divorce. Court hearings and filings added another layer of pressure. Each step in the process required communication, documentation, and decisions about the future. People experiencing divorce often describe the period as emotionally exhausting. The relationship that once defined daily life becomes a source of conflict instead. The routines that once felt comfortable begin to feel uncertain. For those observing from outside the household, the situation may have appeared simply as another marriage coming to an end. Yet inside the relationship, emotions were intensifying. When unresolved conflict grows over time, it can create a sense that something larger is approaching. As tensions between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill continued to rise, the conflict eventually entered another legal arena. In August 2024, Jennifer Gledhill filed a request for a protective order against her husband. Protective orders exist to provide legal protection when one person believes another may pose a threat. Courts evaluate evidence presented by the requesting party and determine whether restrictions should be placed on the other individual's behavior or contact. Initially, a temporary protective order was granted, while the court reviewed the circumstances. Temporary orders are often issued quickly to allow time for a more detailed examination of the situation. During that period, the court considers testimony, documents, and other materials to decide whether a longer-term order is justified. In the case involving Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill, the protective order request added another layer of complexity to an already strained relationship. Legal actions of this type can significantly alter communication between spouses, especially when divorce proceedings are already underway. Court records indicate that evidence was reviewed, including videos and descriptions of confrontations between the two individuals. These materials were examined to determine whether the legal standard for abuse or credible threat had been met. Situations like this often place courts in a difficult position. Judges must evaluate personal disputes using legal definitions that require clear evidence. The decision must balance concerns about safety with the requirement that accusations be supported by proof. In this case, the process of reviewing the protective order request would soon lead to a ruling that shaped the timeline of events that followed. After reviewing the evidence presented during the protective order proceedings, the court reached a decision that altered the course of the dispute. The commissioner assigned to the case concluded that the evidence provided did not meet the legal threshold required to sustain the protective order. As a result, the temporary order that had initially been granted was dismissed. Court findings suggested that while arguments between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill had occurred, the materials submitted did not establish the type of abuse required under Utah law for a permanent protective order. The commissioner's written observations described the relationship as highly confrontational, noting that both individuals appeared engaged in the conflict. Legal rulings of this nature do not resolve the emotional aspects of a relationship. Instead, they address a narrow legal question: whether sufficient evidence exists to justify court-ordered restrictions. For the couple involved, however, the dismissal of the protective order likely carried emotional consequences. Decisions made in court can influence how individuals perceive fairness, validation, and personal safety. In many cases, unresolved tension following such rulings can intensify conflict rather than calm it. The dismissal occurred only days before Matthew Johnson was last seen alive. That timing would later attract significant attention from investigators attempting to reconstruct the events leading up to his disappearance. By the time the protective order dispute concluded, the marriage between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill had reached a point where emotions were running high. Divorce proceedings, legal arguments, and personal grievances had combined to create an environment filled with uncertainty. Relationships experiencing this level of stress often fluctuate between moments of calm and moments of confrontation. Conversations that begin normally can quickly escalate when unresolved issues surface. Reports from court proceedings described interactions between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill as confrontational during this period. The language used in those records suggested that the conflict had reached a stage where communication frequently produced arguments rather than solutions. When relationships reach this stage, emotional responses can become unpredictable. Anger may appear suddenly. Frustration may intensify without warning. Words spoken during heated exchanges can leave lasting damage even after the immediate argument ends. Such volatility does not automatically lead to violence. Many couples navigate periods of severe conflict without crossing that line. Yet researchers who study domestic disputes often point out that the time surrounding separation can carry elevated risk. The reason is simple. Separation changes the balance of a relationship. One person may feel relief while the other feels loss. One may see freedom while the other sees rejection. When those emotions collide within the same household, the potential for serious conflict increases. As the divorce process continued and tensions remained unresolved, the situation surrounding Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill appeared to be moving toward an uncertain outcome. From the outside, the couple's life might still have looked similar to many other families experiencing separation. Yet the combination of legal conflict, emotional strain, and ongoing arguments created a climate where stability was difficult to maintain. Divorce often represents the final stage of a long process of disagreement. By the time legal filings occur, many couples have already spent months or years attempting to address underlying issues. When those attempts fail, resentment can accumulate. For Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill, the months leading up to September 2024 contained several of the elements that investigators later identified as significant: divorce proceedings, a dismissed protective order, and reports of arguments within the home. None of these factors alone explains what eventually occurred. Many relationships end in divorce without leading to tragedy. Yet when investigators later examined the timeline, they recognized that the pressure surrounding the marriage had been increasing steadily. The sense that something unresolved remained between the two individuals became difficult to ignore. At that stage, the situation still appeared to be a troubled marriage moving toward separation. No one outside the household could yet see the event that would soon transform the conflict into a criminal investigation, but the conditions that preceded it were already in place. As the divorce between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill moved forward, the conflict between them did not exist in isolation. Beneath the legal filings and courtroom exchanges, another element had already entered the relationship, one that investigators would later identify as central to understanding what happened inside the home. Jennifer Gledhill had begun communicating with another man. At first, that connection existed quietly, away from the attention of family members and friends. Relationships that develop outside a marriage often begin in subtle ways. Conversations extend longer than expected. Messages appear more frequently. What begins as casual interaction slowly evolves into something more personal. For a time, that developing relationship remained hidden from Matthew Johnson. The household continued operating within the same daily structure. Responsibilities toward work and children remain part of everyday life. Yet secrecy introduces a fragile balance. When one partner in a marriage begins forming a connection with someone else, every conversation carries the risk that the truth will surface. Messages must be concealed. Schedules must be explained. Small details require careful attention. Over time, maintaining that balance becomes increasingly difficult. According to investigators, the relationship between Jennifer Gledhill and the other man eventually developed into an affair. The existence of that relationship would later become a critical part of the case against her. For Matthew Johnson, however, the knowledge of that relationship did not remain hidden forever. At some point in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, he learned that the marriage he was already preparing to leave had become entangled in something else entirely. And that discovery would soon lead to a confrontation that investigators believe changed everything. When a hidden relationship becomes known inside a marriage already under strain, the emotional impact can be immediate and intense. Divorce proceedings alone can generate conflict, but the revelation of an affair often adds a new dimension to the dispute. Investigators later reported that Matthew Johnson confronted Jennifer Gledhill after learning about the relationship. The details of that confrontation have been described primarily through statements presented in charging documents and investigative reports. According to those accounts, the moment represented a breaking point in a marriage that had already been deteriorating for months. Arguments during divorce proceedings frequently revolve around practical issues, property, custody arrangements, or financial responsibilities. The discovery of an affair introduces a more personal dimension. Feelings of betrayal, anger, and humiliation can quickly overwhelm the conversation. For Matthew Johnson, learning that Jennifer Gledhill had been involved with someone else appears to have intensified the conflict that was already shaping their separation. For Jennifer Gledhill, the exposure of the relationship meant that the secret she had been maintaining was no longer hidden. Moments like this often change the trajectory of a relationship immediately. The emotional tone of conversation shifts. Decisions about the future take on new urgency. What had once been a difficult marriage moving toward divorce was now a relationship marked by accusations and confrontation. From that point forward, the conflict between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill would take on a different intensity, one that investigators later believed set the stage for the events that followed. The man involved in the relationship with Jennifer Gledhill has not been publicly identified in most reports. Investigators referred to him as a confidential informant during the early stages of the case. At the time the relationship began, he was not connected to law enforcement or any investigation. He was simply someone who had become involved with Jennifer Gledhill during the period when her marriage to Matthew Johnson was collapsing. That involvement would later place him in an unexpected position. After Matthew Johnson disappeared, the information he possessed would become central to the case. According to investigators, Jennifer Gledhill visited him late one night only days after the alleged killing occurred. During that meeting, authorities say she made statements that would later shape the direction of the investigation. He later told detectives that Jennifer Gledhill described the events surrounding Matthew Johnson's death in detail. At that moment, the man listening to her account had not yet contacted the police. According to reports, he initially struggled to determine whether what he was hearing was real or exaggerated. Confessions delivered in private settings can create profound uncertainty. The listener may question whether the speaker is serious, whether the story is meant to shock, or whether the words represent something that truly occurred. In this case, however, the information he heard would eventually lead him to approach investigators. And when he did, The story he told would transform a missing person investigation into a homicide case. According to prosecutors, the meeting between Jennifer Gledhill and the man she had been seeing took place late on the night of September 22, 2024. Authorities say she arrived at his home visibly upset. What followed during that conversation would later become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. The man told investigators that Jennifer Gledhill described shooting Matthew Johnson while he slept in their bed. According to the account presented by prosecutors, she said the confrontation about the affair had occurred earlier, and the shooting happened the following night. The man also reported that Jennifer Gledhill described how she moved Matthew Johnson's body after the shooting. She allegedly explained that she placed the body in a rooftop storage container, moved it through the house, and later transported it away from the property. Prosecutors say she told the man she eventually buried Matthew Johnson in a shallow grave somewhere north of their home. These statements, if accurate, would represent a direct confession. Yet when the conversation ended, the man still faced an impossible decision. Reporting the story to police meant exposing the relationship he had been involved in. Remaining silent meant carrying knowledge of something that might be far more serious than a private dispute. For a period of time, he hesitated. But the details he had heard would soon lead him to contact investigators. When the man eventually approached police and described what Jennifer Gledhill had allegedly told him, the direction of the investigation changed immediately. Before that moment, the case centered on a missing person whose disappearance raised troubling questions. Investigators had searched for signs of Matthew Johnson and attempted to determine whether he had left voluntarily. The information provided by the man introduced a different possibility. If his account was accurate, Matthew Johnson had not simply disappeared. He had been killed. Authorities began comparing the man's statements with other evidence collected during the investigation. According to prosecutors, several details he described aligned with information detectives were already examining. Investigators also obtained screenshots of messages and recordings of phone calls between Jennifer Gledhill and the man involved in the relationship. Those materials would later become part of the evidence presented in court proceedings. The existence of the affair now carried significance far beyond personal betrayal. It had produced the witness who would ultimately bring investigators their most direct account of what might have happened. The same relationship that contributed to the breakdown of the marriage had also produced the person who would report the alleged confession. And that twist created a question that continues to echo throughout the case. Why would someone reveal something so serious to a person they had only recently come to know? By the time the affair had been revealed and the divorce process was already underway, the environment inside the home shared by Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill had become increasingly strained. What had once been a household organized around routine now carried a sense of tension that neither person could easily ignore. Arguments between couples experiencing separation are not unusual. Yet the disputes between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill were unfolding during a period when several pressures were converging at the same time. Divorce proceedings had already introduced legal conflict. The dismissal of the protective order had left unresolved frustration. The discovery of the affair had added a deeply personal layer of betrayal. Each of these factors alone can place significant strain on a relationship. Together, they formed a combination that investigators later described as critical to understanding the timeline of events. As September 2024 approached its third week, daily life inside the household continued outwardly as usual. The responsibilities of parenting, work schedules, and ordinary routines still existed. Yet beneath that surface, the unresolved conflict between the couple continued to grow. During this period, conversations between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill appear to have become increasingly difficult. According to court documents reviewed by investigators, disagreements related to the affair and the divorce process had become central issues in their interactions. Situations like this can create an environment where small disagreements quickly expand into larger arguments. Emotional reactions become sharper. Words spoken during those moments often reflect the accumulation of months of frustration. Investigators examining the case later concluded that the days immediately before Matthew Johnson was last seen were especially important. Something during that time altered the course of events. According to information later presented by prosecutors, a confrontation occurred between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill on September 20, 2024. The dispute centered on the affair that had recently come to light. Investigators learned that Matthew Johnson had confronted Jennifer Gledhill after discovering that she had been involved with another man. Reports described the conversation as heated, with Matthew Johnson expressing anger about the relationship. Confrontations like this often represent the emotional peak of a deteriorating marriage. When betrayal becomes part of the conflict, conversations rarely remain calm. Accusations and defensive responses can escalate quickly. For Matthew Johnson, the discovery of the relationship may have confirmed fears that had already been developing during the divorce process. For Jennifer Gledhill, the confrontation meant that the private relationship she had attempted to maintain in secret was now fully exposed. Prosecutors later alleged that the argument marked a turning point in the timeline. It was during this period that investigators believe the relationship conflict reached its most intense stage. In many relationships experiencing separation, confrontations like this are followed by distance. One partner may leave temporarily to allow emotions to settle. Others attempt to continue daily routines while avoiding further disputes. Yet, according to the information investigators later gathered, the tension between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill did not simply fade after the argument. Instead, the disagreement appears to have lingered inside the household, and that lingering conflict would soon become one of the most important pieces of the timeline investigators attempted to reconstruct. Events inside private homes often leave few witnesses. Yet in this case, investigators later learned that at least one neighbor had noticed signs of conflict during the period surrounding Matthew Johnson's disappearance. According to police records summarized in court filings, a neighbor reported hearing Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill arguing on the evening of September 21 and into the early hours of the following day. Neighbors frequently become important sources of information in investigations like this. Even brief observations, raised voices, unusual activity, or late-night disturbances can help establish a timeline. The neighbor's statement suggested that the conflict between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill had continued beyond the initial confrontation about the affair. Arguments occurring late at night can indicate that disagreements had not been resolved earlier in the day. When tensions remain high, conversations often continue long after they might normally end. Investigators later evaluated this information carefully because it helped place the couple together during the final hours before Matthew Johnson disappeared. Details like these may appear minor when considered individually. Yet when combined with other evidence, they can help detectives reconstruct the sequence of events leading up to a critical moment. In this case, the neighbor's observation added another layer to the timeline. It suggested that the emotional conflict between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill was still unfolding during the night that investigators would later identify as crucial to the case. As investigators examined the timeline, another important detail began to stand out. After September 21, people who normally communicated with Matthew Johnson stopped hearing from him. Friends, family members, and colleagues later told investigators that they had not received messages or calls from him after that point. The absence of communication was unusual because Matthew Johnson had maintained regular contact with people in his life. Patterns of communication often become critical in missing person investigations. Modern life leaves digital traces through calls, messages, and location data. When a person suddenly stops using these channels, it can indicate that something unexpected has occurred. In this case, Prosecutors later pointed out that Matthew Johnson's phone activity appeared to stop after the period when the argument with Jennifer Gledhill had taken place. That silence soon drew attention from the people who knew him best. Those who expected to hear from him began to notice that something felt wrong. Messages went unanswered. Calls produced no response. The familiar rhythm of communication disappeared. Investigators would later view this gap in contact as one of the first clear indicators that the situation might involve more than a voluntary absence. For those closest to Matthew Johnson, the silence created growing concern. But at that moment, no one outside the household knew what had taken place during the final hours before the communication stopped. When detectives later began reconstructing the timeline, they focused closely on the days surrounding the confrontation between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill. Investigations of this type often involve examining many small details that may not appear important at first. Movement around the house, communication patterns, and observations from neighbors can all contribute to the larger picture. Court documents indicate that detectives eventually learned about additional activities that occurred at the home after Matthew Johnson was last heard from. According to a neighbor's account, Jennifer Gledhill's parents were seen at the house several days later, on September 24, engaged in cleaning activity. At the time, such activity might not have seemed unusual to someone observing from outside. Families often help one another with household tasks during stressful periods. However, once investigators began considering the possibility that a crime had occurred, the observation gained new importance. Cleaning can sometimes remove traces that investigators rely on when determining what happened inside a residence. Because of this, detectives frequently pay attention to any reports of unusual cleaning or changes inside a home after a suspected incident. The neighbor's account, therefore, became another piece of information added to the growing timeline. Each detail investigators collected helped narrow the window of time when Matthew Johnson might have disappeared. As the investigation progressed, detectives gradually identified a specific period that appeared central to the case. The days between September 20 and September 22 formed the most important portion of the timeline. During this period, several key events occurred: the confrontation about the affair, the arguments reported by neighbors, and the sudden end of communication from Matthew Johnson. Investigators later concluded that understanding what happened during those hours would determine the direction of the entire case. Many criminal investigations hinge on identifying a narrow window of time when a critical event took place. Once that window is established, detectives examine every available detail within it. In the case involving Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill, the timeline surrounding those days raised several difficult questions. Why did communication from Matthew Johnson suddenly stop? Why were arguments reported during the same period? And why did the situation inside the household appear to change so dramatically afterward? These questions did not yet provide answers. Instead, they created a framework that investigators would continue exploring. At that stage of the investigation, the events within the home during those days remained uncertain. But detectives believed something had occurred within that short span of time that changed everything. The timeline that investigators later focused on eventually narrowed to a specific night in September 2024. By that point, the conflict between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill had already intensified through months of legal disputes, arguments, and emotional strain. The divorce process was underway. The affair had been revealed. Voices had been raised inside the home during the days leading up to the disappearance. According to prosecutors, the events that followed unfolded during the late hours after the confrontation between Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill. At some point during that night, the household grew quiet. Daily routines in most homes end the same way. Conversations fade. Lights are turned off. The activity that fills the day gradually disappears as people settle into sleep. From the outside, nothing about the house where Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill lived would have appeared unusual. Neighbors nearby had no reason to believe anything significant was about to happen. Inside the home, however, prosecutors believe the tension that had been building for weeks had not disappeared simply because the day had ended. Arguments that occurred during the evening often continue to linger even after the voices stop. Words spoken in anger do not immediately lose their impact. According to the theory presented by investigators, Matthew Johnson eventually went to sleep in the bedroom he shared with Jennifer Gledhill. At that moment, there was no witness inside the room other than the two people involved. What prosecutors say happened next would later become the central claim in the case against Jennifer Gledhill. Prosecutors allege that while Matthew Johnson was asleep in the bed he shared with Jennifer Gledhill, he was shot in the head. Authorities say the weapon used in the alleged shooting was a firearm belonging to Matthew Johnson himself. According to charging documents summarized in reporting, investigators believe Jennifer Gledhill used that weapon during the night while he slept. It is important to understand the legal distinction surrounding this claim. The description of these events comes from the prosecution's theory of what occurred that night. Jennifer Gledhill has pleaded not guilty to the charges against her, and the allegations remain subject to the legal process that determines whether the evidence supports the claim. At the time investigators began building their case, however, they believed that the shooting described in the alleged confession represented the moment when Matthew Johnson's life ended. Because there were no direct witnesses to the event, and the body has not been recovered, the prosecution relies heavily on circumstantial evidence and statements attributed to Jennifer Gledhill. Those statements reportedly include the account she gave to the man involved in the affair. According to that account, the shooting occurred while Matthew Johnson was sleeping. If true, the event would represent a sudden act carried out during a moment when the victim was unaware and unable to respond. That allegation would later shape the entire investigation. If prosecutors are correct about what happened in the bedroom that night, the immediate aftermath would have been marked by a silence very different from the one that usually fills a house after midnight. Ordinary nighttime quiet reflects rest. The silence investigators believe followed the alleged shooting represented something else entirely. According to the theory described in court filings, Jennifer Gledhill was now alone in the room with Matthew Johnson after the gunshot. What happened during the next period of time inside the house remains one of the most difficult parts of the timeline to reconstruct. Investigators rely on later statements and physical evidence to understand how the situation may have unfolded. Authorities say Jennifer Gledhill later described moving Matthew Johnson's body after the shooting. According to the alleged confession reported by investigators, she placed his body inside a rooftop storage container located at the home. Handling a situation like this would require time, effort, and planning. The house that had previously been the center of family life had now become the location of an event prosecutors believed was a homicide. Yet from outside the property, nothing would necessarily have appeared unusual. The neighborhood remained quiet. The surrounding houses remained dark, while investigators later examined evidence suggesting activity inside the home. The outside world continued through the night without knowing what had taken place. According to the account provided to investigators, Jennifer Gledhill allegedly moved Matthew Johnson's body after placing it in the storage container. Prosecutors say she described sliding the container down a set of stairs inside the house and eventually loading it into a vehicle. The physical act of moving a heavy container would require determination and time. Even under ordinary circumstances, transporting large objects through a home and into a vehicle is not simple. Investigators believe that during this stage of the timeline, Jennifer Gledhill was attempting to remove Matthew Johnson's body from the property. The alleged confession states that she later drove north with the container in the vehicle. According to the information presented in court filings, she told the man involved in the affair that she buried Matthew Johnson in a shallow grave somewhere outside the city. Despite extensive searches conducted by authorities and volunteers, the remains of Matthew Johnson have not been located. The absence of a recovered body remains one of the defining elements of the case. Because of that absence, prosecutors rely on other evidence, including statements, digital records, and physical traces inside the home, to support their claim about what occurred that night. The movement of the body, if the allegation is accurate, represents the moment when the alleged crime extended beyond the bedroom into a larger effort to conceal what had happened. Once the alleged removal of the body had taken place, investigators believe Jennifer Gledhill returned to the house where the shooting had occurred. According to prosecutors, the next stage involved attempts to clean the area inside the bedroom. Later searches of the home revealed signs that investigators interpreted as evidence of cleaning activity. Court records described bleach and wipe marks observed during the examination of the room. A mattress had reportedly been replaced, and spots believed to be blood were later analyzed as part of the forensic investigation. These details would eventually become part of the evidence prosecutors presented to support their claim that a violent act occurred in the bedroom. At the time those actions were allegedly taking place, however, the events remained hidden within the house. Outside the home, daily life continued as normal. Neighbors went about their routines. People living nearby had no reason to suspect that investigators would later examine the property as a crime scene. The alleged actions inside the house were known only to the person prosecutors say carried them out. For investigators attempting to reconstruct the timeline later, these details became important because they suggested an effort to remove traces of the event that had occurred. By the time morning arrived, the situation surrounding Matthew Johnson had changed completely. According to the prosecution's theory, the events of the night had transformed a marriage already collapsing under legal conflict into a criminal investigation that would eventually draw national attention. Yet at that moment, no one outside the house knew what investigators would later allege had occurred. Matthew Johnson had not yet been reported missing. His disappearance had not yet become known to colleagues or friends. The timeline that detectives would eventually reconstruct remained hidden. For Jennifer Gledhill, the night prosecutors describe had ended, but the consequences were only beginning. The alleged confession to the man involved in the affair would occur the following day. That conversation would become the first moment when the story of what prosecutors say happened inside the house began to move beyond the walls of the home. When the man later reported the conversation to authorities, investigators began assembling the pieces of a case that did not involve a recovered body or a witnessed crime. Instead, the case would rely on a chain of evidence built from statements, digital records, and forensic findings. The night prosecutors say Matthew Johnson was killed, therefore, marked the turning point in the entire investigation. From that moment forward, every action connected to the case would revolve around one central question: what truly happened inside that house while Matthew Johnson slept? The events prosecutors say occurred during the night described in the previous section did not end inside the bedroom where Matthew Johnson had been sleeping. According to the account presented in court filings, the alleged shooting was followed by an effort to remove Matthew Johnson's body from the house entirely. Investigators say Jennifer Gledhill later told the man involved in the affair that she placed Matthew Johnson's body into a rooftop storage container inside the home. The container, according to that statement, was then moved down the stairs and loaded into a vehicle. If that account is accurate, the alleged actions would have transformed the situation immediately from a private act into a larger attempt to remove evidence from the location where prosecutors believe the killing occurred. Transporting a body is not a simple task. It requires time, physical effort, and the ability to move through a space without drawing attention. The house that had previously been the center of family life would have become the starting point for a journey intended to take Matthew Johnson away from the place where investigators later found traces suggesting violence. Prosecutors believe the transportation of the body represented the first step in concealing what had happened. Yet the most striking detail about this alleged movement was not the act itself. It was where investigators believed the journey eventually led. According to statements described in court documents, Jennifer Gledhill allegedly told the man she had been seeing that she drove north after placing Matthew Johnson's body in the container. Prosecutors say she described digging a hole and burying Matthew Johnson in a shallow grave somewhere outside the area where the couple lived. The precise location of that burial has never been publicly confirmed. Investigators have focused much of their attention on areas in Davis County, north of the couple's home, where digital records suggested Jennifer Gledhill's phone had traveled during the period when prosecutors believed the body was being transported. The alleged burial site became one of the most important unknowns in the entire case. A grave hidden in open land can remain concealed for long periods of time, especially when the person searching does not know exactly where to look. Even a relatively small area of terrain can contain thousands of possible locations. Because the body was never recovered, investigators could not rely on the traditional forms of evidence that often guide homicide cases. Instead, they were forced to search vast areas of land in the hope of finding a single piece of physical confirmation. After Jennifer Gledhill was arrested and charged with murder, search teams began working to locate the place where Matthew Johnson's remains might have been hidden. Law enforcement officers, forensic specialists, and volunteers examined areas that investigators believed might correspond to the movements of Jennifer Gledhill's phone during the night prosecutors say the body was transported. Search operations often rely on multiple techniques. Investigators may analyze satellite imagery, examine soil disturbances, or use specialized equipment designed to detect buried remains. Dogs trained to detect human decomposition may also be deployed in areas where a burial is suspected. In the case involving Matthew Johnson, the search quickly became complicated by the size of the potential search zone. The area north of the couple's home includes open land, wetlands, and other terrain that can make locating a burial site extremely difficult. Even when investigators believe they are searching in the correct region, the exact location of a grave may remain hidden. Each search operation represented an attempt to find the physical evidence that would confirm what prosecutors believe occurred during the night described in the previous chapter. Yet each effort faced the same challenge. No one knew exactly where to look. Experts who study homicide investigations often explain that locating buried remains can be one of the most difficult tasks law enforcement faces, even when investigators have reason to believe that a burial occurred. The absence of precise information can turn the search into an enormous undertaking. A shallow grave may leave only subtle signs on the surface, and those signs can disappear over time due to weather, vegetation, or normal changes in the landscape. In the investigation involving Matthew Johnson, authorities relied heavily on digital evidence to guide their search efforts. Location data from Jennifer Gledhill's phone helped investigators narrow the area where they believed the burial might have taken place. Still, narrowing a search area is not the same as identifying a specific point. Large portions of land remain possible locations. Every field, shoreline, or patch of soil within that region represented a place investigators had to consider. Search teams continued working through those possibilities, examining the terrain carefully. Yet the physical evidence that would confirm the burial site remained hidden. For investigators, the absence of that discovery introduced a complication that would shape the entire prosecution. Homicide cases traditionally rely on a central piece of evidence, the body of the victim. The discovery of remains allows forensic experts to determine how a person died, when the death occurred, and whether injuries match the prosecution's theory of the crime. In the investigation involving Matthew Johnson, that evidence has never been recovered. Authorities say that despite extensive searches, the remains of Matthew Johnson have not been located. The absence of a body changes the nature of a criminal case dramatically. Without physical remains, prosecutors must rely on other forms of evidence to demonstrate that a death occurred and that it resulted from criminal action. Statements attributed to Jennifer Gledhill, digital records showing movements during the relevant time period, and forensic findings inside the home became essential parts of the investigation. Each piece of evidence must work together to establish the story prosecutors believe took place. Yet the absence of Matthew Johnson's body remains the most unusual aspect of the case. It leaves a question that investigators have not yet been able to answer. Where is Matthew Johnson? When investigators realized that Matthew Johnson's body might never be recovered, the case entered a category that is relatively rare in criminal law. It became what prosecutors refer to as a no-body homicide investigation. In these cases, the prosecution must demonstrate that a person has died even though their remains have not been located. That task requires assembling a combination of evidence strong enough to convince a court that the death occurred and that it was the result of a criminal act. For the investigation involving Jennifer Gledhill, the alleged confession to the man involved in the affair became one of the most significant pieces of that evidence. If the account he reported to police is accurate, it provides a detailed description of how Matthew Johnson was killed and how his body was later concealed. Yet until the remains are discovered, the location of Matthew Johnson's burial remains unknown. That absence creates a haunting uncertainty that continues to surround the case. The man whose disappearance first raised questions among colleagues and friends has still not been found, and the search for him continues. The investigation into the disappearance of Matthew Johnson took a dramatic turn because of a conversation that occurred several days after prosecutors say the killing took place. According to investigators, Jennifer Gledhill arrived late at night at the home of the man with whom she had been having an affair. The visit occurred on September 22, only a short time after the night prosecutors say Matthew Johnson was killed. The timing of the visit would later become extremely important. By that point, the alleged shooting described by prosecutors had already occurred. According to the theory presented in charging documents, Jennifer Gledhill had already removed Matthew Johnson's body from the house and buried it somewhere north of the city. Yet no one outside the house knew any of this. To the outside world, Matthew Johnson had simply stopped communicating with the people in his life. When Jennifer Gledhill arrived at the informant's home that night, investigators say she appeared distressed. The man later told police that the visit did not resemble a casual meeting between two people who knew each other. Instead, he described the atmosphere as tense. The conversation that followed would later become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. Because during that conversation, according to the man who later spoke to police, Jennifer Gledhill said something that immediately captured his attention. She reportedly told him she believed her future had just changed. As the conversation continued inside the informant's home, investigators say Jennifer Gledhill made a statement that would later become a critical detail in court documents. According to the man who reported the encounter to police, Jennifer Gledhill told him she was probably going away for a long time. The statement immediately raised questions. At the time it was spoken, Matthew Johnson had not yet been reported missing. No criminal investigation had been announced publicly. Law enforcement had not issued any alerts or warnings. From the outside, nothing suggested that a crime had occurred. For the man hearing the statement, the comment seemed unusual and deeply unsettling. People sometimes make dramatic statements during emotional moments. Yet the words Jennifer Gledhill reportedly used suggested that she believed something serious had already happened. Investigators later noted that the statement occurred before the police had been notified that Matthew Johnson was missing. The man listening to Jennifer Gledhill that night did not yet know exactly what she meant. But according to his later account to detectives, he soon learned. Because after making that statement, Jennifer Gledhill allegedly began describing what prosecutors believe had taken place inside the house only hours earlier. According to the statement later given to investigators, Jennifer Gledhill then described the events prosecutors say had occurred during the night Matthew Johnson was killed. The man told detectives that Jennifer Gledhill said she had shot Matthew Johnson while he slept in their bed. Investigators documented the account in arrest affidavits and charging documents. The man said Jennifer Gledhill explained that the shooting occurred after an argument about the affair earlier that evening. According to his report to police, Jennifer Gledhill went on to describe what she had done afterward. She allegedly said that she placed Matthew Johnson's body inside a rooftop storage container located at the house. She described sliding the container down the stairs and loading it into a vehicle. According to the informant's statement, Jennifer Gledhill told him she had then driven north with the body and buried Matthew Johnson in a shallow grave. These details matched the theory prosecutors would later present in court. The man listening to her account reportedly felt overwhelmed by what he was hearing. He later told detectives that he had never expected to hear something like this, and for a moment, he was not even certain whether the story was real. When someone hears a confession to a serious crime, the reaction is rarely immediate. According to investigators, the man who spoke with Jennifer Gledhill struggled to determine whether the story he had heard represented reality or something else entirely. He later told police that he initially questioned whether Jennifer Gledhill might be exaggerating or speaking emotionally. Confessions delivered in private conversations can create deep uncertainty for the person hearing them. Without physical evidence or witnesses, the listener must decide whether the speaker is telling the truth. In this case, the man reportedly spent days thinking about the conversation. Investigators later learned that the two continued communicating after that night. During those conversations, Jennifer Gledhill allegedly repeated aspects of the story she had already described. According to court documents, the man began saving text messages and eventually recorded phone calls between himself and Jennifer Gledhill. These recordings would later become part of the evidence investigators examined. As the days passed, the man began to realize that the situation might be far more serious than he had initially believed. The story he had heard was beginning to match events that were unfolding outside his control, because soon, Matthew Johnson would officially be reported missing. Once Matthew Johnson's disappearance began drawing attention, the man who had heard Jennifer Gledhill's statements faced a difficult decision. According to investigators, he had initially remained silent because he was uncertain whether what he had heard was real. But as the situation developed, the possibility that the confession might be true became harder to ignore. The absence of Matthew Johnson from work and the concern expressed by people in his life began to suggest that something serious had happened. Eventually, the man decided he could no longer keep the information to himself. On September 28, he contacted law enforcement and told them about the conversation he had with Jennifer Gledhill several days earlier. The information he provided immediately caught investigators' attention. The man explained that he had been involved in a relationship with Jennifer Gledhill and that she had come to his home shortly after the night prosecutors believe Matthew Johnson was killed. He told detectives she had described shooting Matthew Johnson in his sleep and burying his body. The statement represented the first direct allegation explaining what might have happened to Matthew Johnson. For investigators who had been attempting to understand the disappearance, the information changed the direction of the case immediately. After receiving the informant's statement, investigators began examining whether the details he described matched evidence they had already gathered. According to court documents, several elements of his account corresponded with physical findings at the home shared by Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill. Search warrants executed at the residence revealed signs of blood and evidence of cleaning activity in the bedroom. Investigators also examined digital records, including phone data and surveillance footage, to determine whether the movements described in the alleged confession aligned with the timeline. The more detectives reviewed the information, the more the case began shifting from a missing person investigation toward a homicide investigation. The alleged confession provided a narrative explaining several details that had previously appeared confusing. Why Matthew Johnson's phone had been found abandoned, why he had stopped communicating with friends and colleagues, why activity inside the house appeared to have been altered. For investigators, the statement from the informant became a central piece of the case. Because if the account was accurate, It meant the disappearance of Matthew Johnson was not a mystery at all. It was a crime. After receiving the statement from the confidential informant described in the previous section, investigators began examining the home shared by Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill with renewed urgency. Until that point, the disappearance had raised serious concerns, but the information provided by the informant suggested a specific explanation for what might have happened inside the house. Detectives obtained a search warrant and began a detailed examination of the property. Crime scene investigations often require patience and careful attention to detail. Every surface, object, and room must be examined systematically. Investigators document what they see through photographs, measurements, and written notes. When detectives entered the bedroom where Matthew Johnson had been sleeping on the night prosecutors believed the shooting occurred, they began searching for evidence that could confirm or contradict the account described by the informant. The room itself appeared orderly at first glance, yet crime scene analysis often focuses on what lies beneath the visible surface. Investigators look for signs that objects have been moved, replaced, or cleaned. As the search continued, detectives began discovering details that suggested the bedroom had undergone significant changes after the night prosecutors believed Matthew Johnson was killed. Those details would soon become some of the most important physical evidence in the entire case. During the examination of the bedroom, investigators focused closely on the area around the bed. According to police reports and court documents, detectives discovered a bloodstain on the carpet underneath the bed where Matthew Johnson had reportedly been sleeping. Blood was also found on the wooden slats of the bed frame itself. These discoveries immediately drew the attention of investigators because they aligned with the account provided by the confidential informant. According to that account, Jennifer Gledhill had described shooting Matthew Johnson while he slept in the bed. The location of the blood suggested that a violent event had occurred in that exact area of the room. Forensic specialists collected samples from the carpet and the bed frame to determine whether the blood belonged to Matthew Johnson. The analysis of biological evidence often plays a central role in criminal investigations, allowing scientists to identify whose blood is present at a scene. The presence of blood beneath the bed also suggested something else to investigators. It indicated that whatever had occurred in the bedroom had not been completely removed. Even if attempts had been made to clean the area, traces of evidence had remained hidden beneath the furniture. Those traces would become one of the earliest signs that the bedroom might have been the location where Matthew Johnson was killed. As investigators continued examining the bedroom, they noticed additional signs that suggested the room had been cleaned extensively. Police reports indicated that sections of the walls and surrounding surfaces showed evidence consistent with bleaching agents. Bleach is commonly used in household cleaning, but its presence can also draw attention during a crime scene investigation. When investigators encounter large amounts of cleaning chemicals in an area where violence is suspected, it raises the possibility that someone attempted to remove physical evidence. Detectives also discovered carpet cleaning supplies within the house. Taken together, these findings suggested that significant effort had been made to clean parts of the bedroom after the night prosecutors say the shooting occurred. Yet the use of cleaning agents can sometimes create new evidence rather than eliminate existing traces. Chemical cleaners can alter the appearance of surfaces in ways that forensic investigators are trained to recognize. Bleach may lighten fabrics or walls unevenly, revealing areas where cleaning occurred. Investigators documented these observations carefully, noting every location where cleaning appeared to have taken place. Instead of eliminating all signs of the event, the cleaning activity had created patterns that detectives believed indicated an attempt to remove evidence. One of the most striking discoveries investigators reported during the search involved the mattress on the bed where Matthew Johnson had been sleeping. According to court records, detectives learned that the mattress had been replaced after the night prosecutors believed the shooting occurred. The replacement raised immediate questions. Investigators traced the purchase of the new mattress and determined that it had been acquired shortly after Matthew Johnson disappeared. Replacing a mattress is not unusual under ordinary circumstances. However, the timing of the purchase drew attention because it occurred immediately after the period when prosecutors believe a violent event took place in the bedroom. Detectives examined the new mattress and compared it with information gathered from witnesses and purchase records. The discovery reinforced the idea that the bedroom environment had been altered following the night Matthew Johnson was last known to be alive. When investigators reconstruct events at a crime scene, they often look for changes that occurred after the suspected incident. Objects that have been replaced, removed, or moved from their original positions can reveal attempts to alter the appearance of a location. The mattress replacement therefore became another detail investigators added to the growing list of clues inside the home. Further examination of the bedroom revealed additional signs that investigators interpreted as evidence of cleaning efforts. Detectives reported observing wipe marks on surfaces within the room. These marks can appear when a cloth or sponge is used to clean liquid from walls, floors, or furniture. Under certain lighting conditions, wipe marks become visible as streaks or patterns where cleaning products were applied. Forensic investigators are trained to identify these patterns because they often indicate that someone attempted to remove stains from a surface. In the case involving Matthew Johnson, the wipe marks appeared in areas close to where the blood evidence had been discovered. This connection suggested to investigators that the cleaning activity may have occurred in response to the same event that produced the bloodstains. Detectives photographed the marks and documented their locations as part of the evidence collected during the search. The patterns created by the cleaning attempts became important because they revealed where the effort to remove evidence had been concentrated. Rather than eliminating every trace of what happened, the wipe marks provided investigators with a map of the areas that had been cleaned. That map helped detectives understand how the room might have looked before the cleaning occurred. Crime scene investigations often reveal an unexpected truth. Attempts to erase evidence can sometimes produce additional clues. The bedroom where Matthew Johnson had been sleeping became an example of this principle. The discovery of blood beneath the bed, combined with signs of bleaching, wipe marks, and the replacement of the mattress, suggested that significant changes had taken place inside the room after the night prosecutors say the shooting occurred. Each of those elements alone might have been explainable, but together they formed a pattern that investigators believed pointed toward a violent event followed by an effort to remove traces of what had happened. The informant's account had already described a shooting in the bedroom and the removal of Matthew Johnson's body. The physical evidence discovered during the search appeared to support aspects of that story. Investigators continued collecting samples, documenting the scene, and analyzing the materials found inside the home. For detectives working the case, the bedroom had become more than just another room in a house. It had become the location where they believed the truth about Matthew Johnson's disappearance might be hidden. And as the investigation moved forward, the evidence from that room would play a central role in the case against Jennifer Gledhill. When investigators began analyzing the home where Matthew Johnson had been sleeping, the physical clues discovered inside the bedroom suggested that something violent may have occurred. Blood evidence, signs of cleaning activity, and the replacement of the mattress pointed toward an event prosecutors believed had taken place during the night described earlier in the investigation. But modern investigations rarely rely only on what is found inside a house. Technology now plays a central role in reconstructing events. Phones record movement. Vehicles appear on surveillance cameras. Digital systems quietly document daily routines without anyone thinking about it. For detectives working the case involving Matthew Johnson and Jennifer Gledhill, digital evidence quickly became one of the most powerful tools available. Investigators began examining electronic records connected to Jennifer Gledhill's phone and vehicle. These records did not rely on memory or testimony. Instead, they recorded movement automatically. Where a phone traveled, when it stopped moving, when it disappeared from digital networks entirely. By assembling these data points, investigators believed they could reconstruct the movements that took place during the hours following the night prosecutors say Matthew Johnson was killed. What they discovered created a timeline far more detailed than anyone expected. One of the earliest digital clues appeared in the hours after prosecutors believed the shooting occurred. GPS records from Jennifer Gledhill's phone showed movement early in the morning of September 21. According to investigators, the phone traveled to a location where Matthew Johnson's truck would later be discovered parked in a nearby neighborhood. The placement of the truck raised immediate questions. If Matthew Johnson had left voluntarily, investigators expected his phone, vehicle, and personal belongings to follow a predictable pattern. Instead, the digital record suggested that someone had moved the vehicle during the early morning hours. The phone's location data placed Jennifer Gledhill in the same area. For detectives reconstructing the timeline, the discovery created a connection between the truck and the phone. It suggested the possibility that Matthew Johnson's vehicle had been deliberately relocated. This movement became the first digital marker in the timeline investigators were building. Later that same day, the GPS data revealed another movement investigators considered important. The phone connected to Jennifer Gledhill traveled north toward Davis County during the afternoon. This location immediately caught the attention of investigators. Earlier statements attributed to Jennifer Gledhill described driving north and burying Matthew Johnson in a shallow grave. The phone's location data placed her in the same general region during the time prosecutors believed the body was being transported. Digital evidence rarely explains events by itself. But when it aligns with other statements or physical clues, it becomes a powerful investigative tool. The travel pattern north toward Davis County therefore became a major focus of the investigation. Detectives began comparing the phone data with maps, roads, and possible burial locations within the area. Some of those locations would later be searched by investigators, yet the exact burial site remains unknown. Still, the digital trail suggested that the journey described in the alleged confession may have taken place. At approximately 2:37 in the afternoon, the digital timeline recorded something unusual. Jennifer Gledhill's phone stopped transmitting location data. According to investigators, the phone was turned off at that moment. For detectives examining the timeline, the shutdown created a significant gap. Phones normally remain active throughout the day, constantly connecting to networks and updating their locations. Turning off the device removes that digital trail. Investigators later considered the possibility that the phone had been intentionally powered down during a critical moment in the timeline. If the phone was turned off during travel or during activity investigators considered important, that action would prevent the device from recording further movement. The phone remained inactive for more than 2 hours. Then, shortly after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the device reappeared on the network. The digital trail resumed, and the location data revealed that the phone was now traveling again. Later that night, another form of technology captured activity investigators considered significant. Surveillance cameras recorded Jennifer Gledhill's vehicle at a car wash located at a Holiday oil station. The footage showed the vehicle being cleaned thoroughly before leaving the location. According to investigators, the vehicle departed the car wash at approximately 11:07 p.m. Car wash surveillance systems record vehicles entering and leaving the facility. The cameras are designed primarily for security, but in criminal investigations, they often become valuable sources of evidence. The footage suggested that the vehicle was cleaned extensively during the late hours of that evening. Investigators later compared the timing of the car wash visit with the rest of the digital timeline they had assembled. What they noticed next added another critical piece to the sequence of events. Because the location the vehicle traveled to after leaving the car wash was already familiar to investigators. 40 minutes after leaving the car wash, investigators say Jennifer Gledhill arrived at the home of the man who would later become the confidential informant. Digital records and surveillance timing placed the arrival at approximately 11:47. This moment aligned closely with the account the informant had given to police. He told investigators that Jennifer Gledhill arrived at his home late that night and began describing the events prosecutors say had occurred earlier. For detectives reviewing the evidence, the digital timeline appeared to match the informant's story step by step. Morning phone movement near the truck. Travel north toward Davis County, a period when the phone was turned off. Late night cleaning of the vehicle. And finally, the visit where the alleged confession was made. Each digital record became another point on the map investigators were building. Individually, the data points only recorded movement, but together, they created a sequence of events investigators believed was deeply significant. Technology had revealed a timeline that would become one of the most important elements in the case against Jennifer Gledhill. By the time investigators finished examining the digital evidence described in the previous section, they had already developed a working timeline of movements that they believed were connected to the disappearance of Matthew Johnson. Yet the investigation did not end with the reconstruction of Jennifer Gledhill's movements. Detectives began asking another question. Who else may have been present at the house after the night prosecutors say Matthew Johnson was killed? Neighbors who had been interviewed earlier in the investigation began providing additional details. One observation quickly stood out. Several witnesses reported seeing Jennifer Gledhill's parents at the house in the days following the alleged killing. At first, the presence of family members did not automatically suggest wrongdoing. Families often visit one another during times of stress or personal crisis. However, the timing of those visits began attracting the attention of investigators. Witnesses reported seeing Jennifer Gledhill's parents at the home on September 24. That date placed them inside the house only a few days after the night prosecutors believe Matthew Johnson was killed. Detectives decided to examine that visit more closely, because what neighbors described did not appear to be a brief family visit. Instead, witnesses said the two remained at the home for several hours. When detectives interviewed the neighbors again, a more detailed picture began to emerge. According to statements later documented in court filings, witnesses reported seeing Jennifer Gledhill's parents inside the home for an extended period of time. Some neighbors estimated that the visit lasted close to 5 hours. During that time, observers reported seeing activity that appeared consistent with cleaning. Boxes were moved. Items were carried through parts of the house. The garage area appeared to be reorganized. These details immediately raised questions for investigators. By that point in the investigation, detectives already suspected that a violent event had occurred in the bedroom where Matthew Johnson had been sleeping. They had discovered blood evidence beneath the bed. They had documented bleach cleaning on the wall behind the bed. They had identified wipe marks and a recently replaced mattress. If the reports from neighbors were accurate, it meant that other people had been inside the house after the suspected killing. And those individuals might have been involved in altering the condition of the home. Investigators began examining whether the visit by Jennifer Gledhill's parents had played a role in the events that followed the alleged killing. One detail from the investigation connected directly to the changes that had been discovered in the bedroom. When detectives traced the purchase history of the mattress that had replaced the original one, they discovered that the purchase had been made by Jennifer Gledhill's mother. According to statements later described in affidavits, she acknowledged to investigators that she had bought the mattress after Jennifer asked her to do so. The timing of that purchase drew immediate attention. Investigators believed that Matthew Johnson had been killed on the original mattress that had previously been in the bedroom. That mattress had disappeared. The new one appeared shortly afterward. If the statements regarding the purchase were accurate, it meant that Jennifer Gledhill's mother had helped provide the replacement. For detectives trying to understand how the condition of the bedroom had changed after the night prosecutors say the shooting occurred, the mattress purchase became a critical piece of information. Because replacing the mattress had altered the most central object in the suspected crime scene. and investigators now believe that the replacement might have involved assistance from someone outside the immediate household. Digital evidence soon began drawing investigators even deeper into the question of whether Jennifer Gledhill's parents had played a role in events following the alleged killing. Phone records showed that Jennifer Gledhill had communicated with her father during the same time period when prosecutors believe Matthew Johnson's body was transported north. According to investigators, the phone records indicated that one of the only calls Jennifer made during that time was to her father. For detectives attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events, the call added another layer to the timeline. It suggested that communication between Jennifer Gledhill and her parents may have taken place while critical events were unfolding. Investigators also examined phone activity connected to Jennifer Gledhill's mother. During the investigation, detectives discovered that her phone had been remotely reset, which erased its stored data. Resetting a phone can occur for many reasons, but when it happens during an active criminal investigation, it often draws immediate scrutiny. The erased data meant investigators could no longer examine the phone's history for messages, location records, or calls. For detectives already studying the role of Jennifer Gledhill's parents in the days following Matthew Johnson's disappearance, the phone reset raised additional concerns. As investigators continued reviewing witness statements, digital records, and physical evidence, prosecutors eventually reached a conclusion that dramatically expanded the scope of the case. Authorities alleged that Jennifer Gledhill's parents may have helped conceal evidence after the suspected killing. According to the charges later filed, prosecutors believed they assisted with cleaning inside the house and participated in actions that may have interfered with the investigation. Obstruction of justice charges often arise when investigators believe someone knowingly interfered with the discovery of evidence or attempted to conceal information relevant to a crime. The allegations against Jennifer Gledhill's parents introduced a new dimension to the case. What had initially appeared to be a dispute between two spouses had now expanded into a broader investigation involving additional family members. For detectives working the case, the development raised an unsettling possibility. If the allegations were correct, the effort to conceal what had happened to Matthew Johnson may not have been carried out by a single person. Instead, investigators believed that others might have helped alter the scene and remove evidence. That possibility created a second major twist in the investigation. As the investigation progressed, the involvement of Jennifer Gledhill's parents added another layer of complexity to the case. The search for Matthew Johnson's body was still underway. Detectives were still analyzing the physical evidence discovered inside the house. Digital records continued to be examined in an effort to confirm the movements described earlier in the timeline. Now, investigators were also examining whether additional people had played a role in events that followed the alleged killing. For the community where Matthew Johnson had lived and worked, the story was becoming increasingly difficult to comprehend. What began as a missing person case had grown into a homicide investigation. Then it expanded again to include allegations that family members might have helped conceal evidence. Each new development added another layer to the unfolding narrative. Yet one moment was still approaching that would change the case more dramatically than any discovery made so far. Because investigators were preparing to take the next step in the investigation, they were preparing to make an arrest. By early October 2024, investigators believed they had assembled enough evidence to take decisive action. The timeline built from digital records, the physical evidence discovered inside the home, and the statements from the confidential informant had gradually formed the foundation of the case. Detectives believed the pieces now fit together in a way that explained the disappearance of Matthew Johnson. The prosecution's theory described a sequence of events that began with a confrontation over an affair, continued with the alleged shooting while Matthew Johnson slept, and ended with the transportation and burial of his body in an unknown location. Although the body had not yet been found, investigators believed the evidence supported the conclusion that Matthew Johnson had been killed. With that conclusion in place, authorities prepared to move forward. On October 2, 2024, Jennifer Gledhill was arrested in connection with the case. The quiet disappearance that had first raised concern among friends and colleagues had now become a criminal case involving one of the most serious accusations possible. When prosecutors formally filed charges against Jennifer Gledhill, the scope of the case became clear. Court documents listed 9 felony counts connected to the disappearance and presumed death of Matthew Johnson. The charges included first-degree murder. Additional counts included obstruction of justice, abuse of a human body, witness tampering, and other related offenses tied to the alleged effort to conceal what had happened. Jennifer Gledhill entered a plea of not guilty. In criminal proceedings, a not guilty plea signals that the accused disputes the allegations and intends to challenge the prosecution's case in court. The legal process that followed would determine whether the evidence presented by prosecutors was sufficient to prove the charges. At that moment, however, the case had already captured the attention of the community. The disappearance of Matthew Johnson was no longer treated as a missing person mystery. It had become a homicide prosecution. The arrest quickly spread through the community where Matthew Johnson had lived and worked. Friends, neighbors, and fellow members of the Utah National Guard struggled to process the news. For many people who knew Matthew Johnson personally, the idea that he had been killed inside his own home was difficult to comprehend. The case also carried an emotional weight for the soldiers who had served alongside him. Members of the Guard participated in searches for Matthew Johnson's remains, determined to bring closure to a case that had deeply affected those who knew him. For neighbors living near the house where the alleged crime occurred, the investigation had transformed a familiar street into the center of a major criminal case. The quiet neighborhood, where the events unfolded now, appeared repeatedly in national news coverage. What had begun as a missing person investigation had evolved into a story that people across the country were following. As more details about the investigation became public, media coverage